Coming up on Omnivore, adapting sensory science to regional and cultural differences, the challenges of catching food fraud, and a contrarian view on the lasting impact of GLP-1s. It's episode 56 of Omnivore, from the editors of Food Technology magazine and the Institute of Food Technologists.
This episode of Omnivore is brought to you by IFT Virtual Workshops, where you stay in the know instead of on the go. Learn more about all 4 of our exciting new virtual workshops on the career development page at ift.org.
Welcome to Omnivore from IFT and Food Technology, where we explore the intersection of business, science, and technology in the global food system. I'm Bill McDowell. As its name suggests, sensory science is a discipline focused on understanding how we perceive the world through our senses. For food scientists, it's an important product development tool thanks to the window it opens into understanding consumer preferences. But it's not a one-size-fits-all discipline. An award-winning South African sensory scientist, Henriette de Kock, has devoted her career to reimagining sensory science approaches. Specifically, her goal is to ensure that it functions effectively in Africa, where food preferences and cultural traditions are widely divergent across the continent. She discusses her work with Food Technology's Mary Ellen Kuhn.
Henriette, you've been working as a sensory scientist for 30 years. What makes sensory science so interesting to you?
Well, so I think it's so diverse in terms of the different senses, and the fact that a human is an instrument and can integrate sound, sight, smell, taste, touch, and at the same time and come up with responses, and then also, link that to hedonic response. We all eat. We all experience food with our senses, but as a researcher, I can really study and understand that process.
I think I've heard people who work in the discipline of sensory science talk about it being multifaceted.
Exactly. So, it's so many different things all at the same time. And then your brain has to integrate all of that multifaceted information and build a picture or a response to it.
I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about why the application of sensory science principles are so important in Africa.
So if I look at African countries and I travel around, we see that there's currently major and widespread shifts in the diets of people in Africa. And it's often referred to as the nutrition transition. So how people are adapting or changing their diets from the traditional diets where they used to grow all their food and now moving to the cities, for example, and then adjusting the diets completely. So this shift is linked to many factors. Urbanization is just one. Climate change is another, but globalization and social media influences have a major influence on how people in African countries are changing their diets. And you may say, well, this has happened all over the world for the last couple of centuries, but in Africa, we are in the unique situation where we still have a chance to, and they talk about bending the curve. So we can learn from the mistakes of the past or learn from the mistakes of other, let's say, the more developed regions.
Well, that seems like a really positive approach, learning from the mistakes that have been made elsewhere and taking advantage of the opportunity to apply it in Africa.
Yeah. I think that's the challenge, not to repeat the same issues. If we look globally, the rise in obesity, the rise in non-communicable diseases are often to some extent linked to diets and dietary shifts and changes. So we have a chance to have an impact, and that's the challenge for scientists in Africa as well.
Well, one of the things that you mentioned, I think would be interesting to focus a little bit more on, if you would, and that's the diversity in Africa. How do you address that?
I would say capacity building. So first of all, recognizing that what people eat in Nigeria is completely different to what they eat in South Africa or in Ethiopia. So the customs are different. The food combinations are different. The way food is sourced. Even if you take the same type of basic meal, so a staple in many African countries would be something based on a cereal product prepared as a gruel or a porridge, and even that, the consistency, the viscosity, the way the meal is prepared is very different in the different countries.
Sounds complicated.
Yeah, so we need to build a lot of capacity in terms of sensory and consumer science practitioners, I would say, on our continent. And it's also one of the areas that I like to be involved in. We've created an African network for sensory evaluation research, really with the aim of building such capacity in different countries.
Well, that's a project you started, isn't it?
Yeah, it was really something that I feel passionate about. We started that I think it was 2018, and it was the reason why I was hoping that we could drive it is I had an experience with a similar network in Europe, and I could see the richness of what you learn from others. So networks are really important to develop, and I wanted to create a version of such a network on the continent. But it's a huge continent, so even traveling to different countries is something new to me as well. Last year, at the end of November, we had a conference for this, or we had a conference for the African network in Ghana. It was my first time in Ghana. I really enjoyed seeing the cultural diversity, how it's different, how people eat, how they combine food products and what they source. So yeah, there's a lot to learn.
You work with young students, and it sounds like they're from all over Africa. Tell me about one or two of the projects that your students are working on.
So a lot of the indigenous food products were traditionally consumed, but they fell out of favor and they are being replaced with, I would say, global staples or global products like bread, etc. And we are with lots of other researchers developing food products from these indigenous crops that can then be used in the markets in Africa. Because often the indigenous crops are more climate resilient, and that's important from a sustainability point of view as well.
Oh, so double benefits, more healthful and also more sustainable.
Exactly. And it's also about creating or developing value chains, developing local food value chains, so that we source locally, we allow for local manufacture, allow for improvement of the livelihoods of the populations.
Again, multifaceted.
Exactly, yeah. But the key in all these projects is always to keep nutritional value of individual products top of mind. So the nutritional value of the individual products, but then also the diet composition and the dietary requirements that we have in mind. Many people in African countries, and especially young children, are very dependent on single source products, so staples, the staple food that they receive as school feeding. And some of our efforts are focused on those staples to make sure that they are optimized from a nutritional point of view, because these groups, let's say the young school children, are so dependent on those specific food products. So I can give an example of a project that we are running in East Africa, where we are looking at replacing refined maize meal. You might call it cornmeal, but refined maize meal with whole grain options, because the whole grain options have nutritional benefits. The downside of having a whole grain meal is that you have a shorter shelf life. So that's where the sensory scientists come in to study the shelf life processes and to look at ways to improve that limitation or address that limitation then.
That's a very interesting example. Thanks for sharing that.
Henriette de Kock is a researcher and professor in the Department of Consumer and Food Sciences at the University of Pretoria in South Africa. Learn more about the ways that she's working to apply sensory science to improve the diets of African consumers in the March issue of Food Technology. We'll be back with more Omnivore in a moment, but first, this word from our sponsor.
With IFT's new virtual workshops, the learning comes to you. Explore the latest trends, breakthroughs, and research findings that matter most to you, each presented by renowned thought leaders and innovators at the forefront of the science of food community. Learn more and register today at ift.org.
Welcome back to Omnivore. I'm Bill McDowell. Cases of food fraud, whether by adulteration, mislabeling, counterfeiting, substitution, or tampering, have risen tenfold in the past 4 years. That increase, which has been reported by the SGS DigiComply Food Safety Intelligence Hub, underscores an increasing challenge to food safety professionals, as it suggests a gain in the sophistication and frequency of fraudulent acts. That increase not only threatens consumer safety and confidence, but also exposes food companies and distributors to significant financial risks. Food Technology's Julie Larson-Brisher spoke with a leading expert on food fraud prevention, Dr. John Spink at Michigan State University, who shed some light on why food fraud remains a significant but unseen problem and suggests next steps in preventing this activity.
Hi, John. Welcome to Omnivore.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Well, let's dive right in. I'd really like to know, is food fraud still a significant issue today, or has it been mostly contained? I mean, we don't hear much after that horse meat scandal of 2013, where, just to remind our listeners, some unscrupulous suppliers misled European consumers by substituting cheaper horse meat for beef. Does that mean the threat has lessened, or is it just more below the radar?
That is a great question, one that I get quite a bit. I mean, one thing that's great in working with you is things like us being able to talk about this. And one thing, in addition to talking here, we've got a virtual workshop coming up on food fraud prevention, looking at the big picture again, and looking at the big key there is supply chain management, enterprise risk management, getting the foundation before we look forward. When we look at this, the key is that, way back, 2007-ish was Sudan Red, was a carcinogen, colorant, showed up, kind of went away. It comes back and forth a little bit. And then melamine. So melamine hit. And that was the big one. That got a shock. But then there was a feeling like that our food safety systems caught it and went away. Now, number one, we caught it because people got sick. That's not really prevention. So people started to look at it, but not acting. And then horse meat, as you mentioned, hit there, around 2013. And that was really intense. And that got people like GFSI, IFT, and others looking at this. And so GFSI required prevention in 2017, 2018. And usually it takes about 2 years for things to get really rolling. Well, what happened in 2020 then? COVID. So just as people were in their second iteration of the vulnerability assessments, strategies, getting ready to do it, you learn the second time, you say, well, we should probably really start to look at this in more detail. COVID hit. At that point, we're trying to just figure out, how to open up Zoom and find enough product to work. So things kind of calmed down right then.
Well, a lot of people think that after those kind of high profile incidents like the horse meat scandal and the more recent cinnamon and lead chromate cases, the industry must have learned its lesson. But have we really made enough progress in preventing food fraud, or are there still gaps in the system that consumers and businesses should be worried about?
One thing that's a constant challenge of food fraud prevention is it's constantly evolving. And we're dealing with an intelligent adversary. This isn't E. coli that will evolve in some natural way. This is an intelligent adversary. And so they're constantly changing. Every time we do something, they do something else. It's a massive chess match. So it's been hard. It's been hard in that sense because it's a change. It's a criminology perspective, not as much of a food science perspective. And along the way, then, systems have been put in place and we're catching a lot. I think the fraudsters are evolving. And so we just every so often we need to kind of look at it again from a little afar and just adjust what we're doing.
Well, what do you see, John, as the next frontier in food fraud prevention? Is the industry doing enough to coordinate efforts across the supply chain, or could a lack of communication between stakeholders set us up for another major scandal in the future?
Really interesting to think about a lack of communication or kind of unaware of communication that we could do. Just really, it's an evolving risk. Again, I go back to the timing of this. So GFSI, well, for us, we first defined food fraud in 2011. Our article was the first time it was defined in academic sense. And usually the scholars will say 10 years later is when it gets implemented, which again is around 2011. Actually, it was Journal of Food Science. So IFT Journal, thank you. Or you're welcome. But then about 10 years. So that's around the 2018. So we were actually ahead of the game. But again, COVID hit. And COVID led companies to go back to just try to find a way. Well, now that I teach supply chain management, it's assurance of supply. We're trying to figure out, just how to get enough product. And so that's the big key at the start. At that point, then companies are then now moving back to looking at true prevention. And we find right now in early 2025, the board of directors are based on everything going on in the world. There's uncertainty everywhere multiplied by uncertainty. That the board of directors are now starting to ask people, what's the inherent nature of the vulnerability of the operations of things that you do? And food fraud now is one of those things that's getting a lot more attention from that level.
Yeah, we hear a lot too about vulnerability assessments. Is that changed at all? How we do that?
The thing that's crazy is that very first article, very little has changed from that. And we were kind of forced. Actually, early on, it was Jennifer McIntyre was one from you that pushed us. I remember the very first time she invited me to speak at one of the pre-conference workshops, I was kind of surprised because I thought I was just this little, tangent type of researcher. But we were forced to really look at the big picture. And we dug deep into the basics of risk management, enterprise risk management in companies. And so the actual vulnerability assessments really haven't changed that much. The key with that is then whatever you did in 2017, the same process applies. The thing is a vulnerability assessment leads you to look broadly at all vulnerabilities. So it's not like we're only looking at chemical and now it's physical or then biological. We were looking at all of them. So whether it was Ukraine, Russia, whether it was melamine or lead chromate or you name it, it's still looking at the world and saying where are there inherent vulnerabilities. So the thing that is great about this is that the core process is GFSI. I bet the GFSI guidance and scope for food fraud will never change. I mean, it's so broad and applicable that it's already logical to cover everything. And so you say the nature of vulnerability assessments, the process has not changed, but we're just getting better at the frame we look at and the scope and the context, and then being quicker about what those things we are trying to act upon.
Right. Well, now earlier you mentioned the virtual workshop that you'll be conducting. And so I'm excited to hear a little bit more about that. I know it's a 4-part IFT virtual workshop on food fraud prevention, reducing disruptions through supply chain, and enterprise risk management. Can you give us a few more details about what you'll be covering in there?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think that a lot of times when we present, it's like you're looking in a portal, a porthole. You're looking at a porthole of a ship, and we're the inside of the ship. There's so much there. It's kind of overwhelming. We've got these massive open online courses, MOOCs. They're 50 hours and 7 courses and cover advanced criminology and all sorts of stuff. It's a bit overwhelming. So the thing that we were really looking at is that there needs to be a way, as people are starting to look at food fraud again, to look at it fresh, as either a reminder of the scope, but also how it fits into the rest of the business. And so it was perfect timing, I think, for this to come together, to be an introduction again to the topic if people are new to it, or a reminder of the scope. If they're experts and have been dealing, deep into food authenticity. I mean, I look at your journals a lot, and there's a lot of great detailed science, but reminding the scientists what the broad business concepts are, reminding the business people what the science is, and then in general, what we're trying to do to look at this. The bottom line is it's criminology, and we're trying to lead the bad guys to not even try to attack us. And that's the bottom line. So I think it's simplifying it to the big picture. So we've got this I think it's a great 4-part series there. It's not going to be too overwhelming, but I think at the same time, it's going to open up eyes of where in different areas people need to focus and where they're a bit vulnerable themselves.
Well, thanks. So it's been really great talking with you today, John, and we'll keep watching this space, maybe with extra monitoring.
Well, thank you. I think as a closing thought for me is that, food fraud is constantly evolving. The focus on prevention from the very start has been critical. The focus on vulnerabilities rather than risks. Vulnerabilities are system weaknesses that are there whether there's an attack or not. And vulnerabilities are things that you can work on. It's you locking your doors before you leave your house at home. And so those vulnerabilities and vulnerability reduction are the same that it's always been. So we're doing this virtual workshop with IFT. I think it's a great way for us to get out to talk to more people. You're showing people that this is a topic and you help focus it. And we're really excited about it. So thank you very much for your time.
John Spink is an assistant professor and director of the Food Fraud Prevention Academy at Michigan State University and is recognized as a leading expert on food fraud prevention. He'll lead IFT's new 4-part virtual workshop on food fraud prevention April 1st through 10th of 2025. Visit IFT.org to learn more and register. The food industry thrives on its quest for the next big thing, whether it's the latest superfood, a revolutionary ingredient, or a dietary shift that promises to change the way we eat. Lately, all eyes have been on GLP-1 drugs like Ozempic, hailed as a game changer for weight management and potentially for the business of food itself. But food strategist and commentator Arlin Wasserman isn't convinced. He argues that despite early excitement, GLP-1 drugs may not be the industry disruptor that many anticipate. In a recent conversation, Wasserman shares his perspective on the true impact of these medications and why history suggests they may not reshape long-term food consumption as dramatically as some expect. Well, hey there, Arlin. It's been a long time. Welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks, Bill. It's great to be here with you.
So there's a lot of buzz out there right now in both the pharmaceutical circles as well as the food circles about GLP-1 drugs and the impact that they're having on eating habits. But you're a bit of a skeptic in terms of what you expect the long-term impact to be. Why don't you explain a little bit for some of the reasons behind your skepticism?
Sure. So first of all, I see why everyone is excited, right? For the pharmaceutical industry, they're saying it's $100 billion market. For the food industry, it's the next new thing. And, it is the magic bullet, supposedly, that a growing number, both by number and by waist size, in America want, which is a pill that makes us look skinny without having to really change much else. So why wouldn't we all be excited? And I think it's the one thing that not a lot of people talk about. And I shared this with you when we decided to do this podcast, which is while there's an enormous number of people who are interested in GLP-1, the reality is, based on some assessment of insurance claims of those who were covered for GLP-1 drugs last year, and we're recording this in early 2025, about 60% of people who started the medication stopped at about 12 to 16 weeks. And you really are supposed to stay on it for much, much longer, and maybe even for life. And that rate of abandonment by those who are most enthusiastic and eager to try it is not a great sign. It's a great drug until you try it and see the side effects. It's also a great drug until you have to pay for it. Insurance coverage matters a lot for a drug that costs $1,000 a month. Will insurance companies be required to cover it? This is at a time when my own insurance company, Independence Blue, is starting to limit coverage for GLP-1, except for those who are morbidly obese. I'm not a lawyer. They probably have a different definition, but a lot of people are finding out they're suddenly not covered. It's very unclear that there's ever going to be any government requirement that this be covered by insurance. So instead, you have the next generation of users looking at higher out-of-pocket costs or completely paying for this out-of-pocket. There's a lot more there. But when you have people who try the drug, stop using it, the next group of people who weren't that eager or a little more skeptical or a little more cautious, it's not a good sign.
So let's talk about the food side implications, because you pointed out in the dialogue article that you wrote for Food Technology that there's some historical precedent here. You compared it to Olestra back in the 90s, and even to some of the hype that's been around plant-based meat alternatives in the past couple of years. Walk through some of those parallels and what can we learn from that?
Sure. So, Olestra was kind of like a mini GLP-1. You could eat all the crispy fried foods you want, potato chips, whatever, and not gain weight, not absorb the calories. It was going to be a huge change in the food industry. I think it might have gotten up to $200 million in sales of all Olestra products, although none are available on the market anymore. 200 million is a big number if it's your or my annual salary, or maybe even our stock portfolio. It's not a big number for our industry. We just got to be honest. And one of the reasons was sort of a parallel to GLP-1. If you tried Olestra, you enjoyed your potato chips, but you ended up running to the bathroom an hour or two later for most people. And that's just too big a sacrifice. We thought it was the next big thing. The side effects were not worth the trade-off for enjoying your food without gaining weight. And it disappeared. Plant-based is a little bit different, but not entirely. Everyone said they're going to be the next $10 billion market or more and replace huge chunks of beef or poultry or pork. The challenge with those is twofold. First, for a lot of people, soy protein isolates and even pea protein isolates are hard to digest. They might not make you run to the bathroom, but they might have you belching and feeling like your pants are tight and a little inflamed. The bigger thing with those was, one size fits all. While you and I might be able to grill up a chicken breast or a hamburger or a sausage and flavor it 100 different ways, and then add condiments on top of it, manufactured meat replacements not only have the consumer knock now of being ultra processed, which kind of is like the new trans fat, But also they taste exactly one way, and that flavor is locked in at the factory. They're hydrophobic or avoid absorbing liquids and new flavors, while real meat, poultry, and other animal proteins, fish, eggs, whatever, are hydrophilic and love to absorb new flavors. So the variety isn't there. It's again a different problem because they looked good to start. People were interested, just like they're interested in GLP-1. The reality is eating that burger in a restaurant or at a tasting or in a grocery store is one thing, but to bring it home and have exactly the same flavor twice or 3 times a week is very different. In each of these, though, of course, it is the investors who lead the market to say this is the next big thing, because early in and perhaps timely out is how you make money.
I'm curious what your reaction is to, in some cases, we're starting to see some actual industry reaction to this phenomenon, this trend. We've got Nestle that has done their Vital Pursuit, and Conagra's got their On Track labeling, which are very much sort of specifically targeting GLP-1 users. What's your take just in terms of what we're seeing there?
I'm not inside all of those companies. I'm inside some of them with our work. But, high protein, high fiber, smaller portions, these are not new innovations. And it's a pretty small risk to say, can we change our packaging or put the same products or almost the same products in different packaging and hope we gain some market share or boost some sales as people stock up their fridges and freezers while they buy their Ozempic prescription? That's just really a packaging cost, and we change packaging all the time. So what I don't see is a lot of innovation in terms of truly reformulating foods that aren't already available in a higher fiber, higher protein, greater satiety, or, downsizing a portion. What might be the holy grail for a company like Nestle and some other smaller startups, which is truly personalized functional nutrition products that say you are obese or you are morbidly obese or you are shooting for a 15-pound or a 25-pound loss, or you are active and need more carbs, or you are not active, all those tweaks that might say, who is my GLP-1 user? They're not there yet. And frankly, as I said before, I don't think there's a reason to go there. But functional nutrition has been a goal. And there's an inventory goal and a merchandising goal and a challenge and a shelf space challenge with all of those. Throwing the GLP-1 friendly label on it won't really change the challenge of getting that to happen.
There's always that herd mentality.
Yeah.
There's that fear of getting left behind. So everyone's looking at this, and you do work with and advise a lot of food companies. What are the signs that you'll be watching, or that you would tell them to be watching, whether ultimately this does hit a tipping point where it's something that they should be reacting to, or whether this is just going to fade like so many other fads?
If you really watch the numbers, and I will be, and look at when GLP-1 is no longer in short supply and ask, have sales gone up or has demand gone down? Watch carefully if in the next, given when we're broadcasting this, by middle of summer, whether the government has mandated insurance coverage for GLP-1, at least for those who are obese or overweight and obese, or not. And those are 2 good tells. And if the pharmaceutical companies themselves begin cost subsidy promotions like they've done to create other, not $100 billion, but $10 billion markets for things like Eliquis for heart disease, where they have to subsidize the price to get people to switch to their prescriptions, those are signs that demand is soft. When you're buying these specific meals to go with your GLP-1, when do they go on special? Or when do they go from the top position at an end cap or in the center eye level shelf of a freezer down a couple shelves? those are signs that velocity is not where it was forecast. Not giving up. No one wants to miss out, but there's another new thing that's coming in.
Arlin Wasserman is a frequent contributor to Food Technology magazine and the founder and managing director of Changing Tastes, where he consults with companies to identify and catalyze shifts in the way businesses and consumers think about food. You can read more of his thoughts on the staying power of GLP-1 drugs in the March issue of Food Technology.
Thank you to our sponsors for this episode, IFT Virtual Workshops. Grow your career and satisfy your quest for knowledge without the stress and expense of travel. Get all the details on our career development page at ift.org and register today.
And that wraps up this episode of Omnivore. Thanks again to all our guests and my colleagues at Food Technology. Omnivore is produced and distributed by the Institute of Food Technologists. If you enjoyed today's show and want to learn more about Food Technology magazine or how to join the conversation by becoming an IFT member, visit ift.org/membership. For more in-depth discussion about innovation in the science of food, check out IFT's other podcast, Side Dish, on the News and Publications page of ift.org. If you have comments or suggestions for future shows, just send us an email. The address is editors@ift.org. For the entire team at Food Technology and IFT, I'm Bill McDowell. Thanks for listening, and join us again for our next episode.